So where we've gotten to so far, right, just to recap, is we've been able to write down a model where we're going to allow people's choices to be influenced by the choices of other people, right, either because people have a desire to conform or they've got a desire to distinguish themselves. And we've been able to work out, in a kind of general way, right, but still, we've been able to work out essentially how all these different people's choices are going to interact to produce some social equilibrium, right, to figure out, given that I'm reacting to you and you're reacting to me, how are we all going to end up making a choice together, right? What choices are going to be maintainable? What choices are not going to be maintainable? What kind of changes to external circumstances might shift our equilibrium? That's all pretty cool. What that doesn't let us do yet, though, is to think in a serious way about how these social forces might preserve inequalities, right? Akerlof makes this claim that the consequence of social influences can be to preserve a class system, right? To inhibit upward mobility for low-income people, inhibit downward mobility for higher-income people. And what we've done so far doesn't give us any of that, right? Because everyone should be trying to conform to the same social average. Everyone should be trying to distinguish themselves against the same social standard, right? All of us are comparing ourselves to the average person. So Akerlof is going to add two elements to this to allow us to be able to think about class societies, stratification, and other concepts about the inhibition of mobility. The first of these concepts is is basically this analogy he makes to gravity, right? Which is essentially to say that we're more influenced by people close to us than by people far away. So, if we think about actual gravity, right, physical gravity in the real world, presumably, even though we're remote, right, presumably we're all currently stuck in some way to planet Earth, right? The reason we're stuck to planet Earth is really, really big, but also, and more importantly, planet Earth is really close to us, right? The sun is bigger than the Earth, Jupiter is bigger than the Earth, Alpha Centauri is bigger than the Earth, but the sun, Jupiter, and Alpha Centauri don't matter as much to where we go as the Earth does, because with gravitational force, the closer two particles are to each other, the stronger the gravitational force pulling them together, right? This is why we have planets, this is why we have suns, this is why matter tends to clump together into little balls, surrounded by vast, vast spaces of nothingness, rather than just being evenly distributed like a cosmic soup all across the galaxy, right? This makes sense? Akerlof says in exactly the same way, right, that you're stuck to planet Earth rather than being stuck to Jupiter. In exactly that same way, you're going to have stronger social influence for the people who are most like you. And the idea here is essentially that if we think about the value of social exchanges, essentially the closer, getting a little bit closer to someone brings even more value if that person was already close than if that person was far away, right? Your best friend in the world matters more to you, making them love you a little bit more matters more to you than having a total stranger like you a tiny bit more. Right? This is the reason that people tend to conform to people within their kind of tight-knit social circle, tight-knit social world, rather than worrying what people very, very, very far away do. Right? This makes sense? The consequence of this is going to be, once you have whole clumps of people who are high income, whole clumps of people who are low income, if you're in the low income clump, there might be a big empty social gulf before you can make your way to the high income clump. Right? This might be the reason that we talk about things like high school grads versus college grads, rather than caring as much about how many semesters of college you went to, right? If you've got 2.5 semesters of college, that's not going to put you up in the social clump of college graduates in the same way that finishing school is. Does this make sense? Cool. This is the first concept, right? People close to you matter more than people who are far away. The second concept is that similarity can be defined among multiple dimensions. In other words, you might benefit more from interactions with someone who's close to you in terms of their education, if they're also fairly close to you in terms of their income. right? You might have a better friendship with someone. It might matter more to you that you share taste in music with someone if you also share taste in clothing with someone, right? People vary along a number of dimensions, and from this gravity perspective, closeness in one dimension is more important the closer you are to someone in the other dimension. Now, the way we're going to use this concept in particular to think about social mobility and social class is to say that we've got two dimensions that matter here, which is going to be similarity in childhood and similarity in adulthood. The idea here is going to be that from this gravity perspective, the most valuable social relationships for a particular person are going to be social relationships with someone who understands where you came from, right? Understands the way that you grew up because they grew up similarly to you, and understands where you are right now, right? Is living a similar life to you now, has similar economic social circumstances for you now. And again, right, we can think about this from a psychological perspective, we can think about this from a practical perspective. From a psychological perspective, you want to spend time with people who understand what you're going through, right? Who understand the problems or feelings you have about your mom, right? And the kind of relationship that has. Or how it feels to have childhood friends or siblings who are going through really difficult economic circumstances. So that even if you're very, very high income as an adult, right, it might be easier to relate to people who grew up low income if you grew up low income. And likewise, right, if you grew up high income, it might be easier to relate to other people who grew up high income. And then the reason you care that people are similar to you in adulthood, right, someone who's got similar occupation, similar earnings, similar education to you is going to be able to give you job leads, right? They're going to be able to give you advice about your career. Someone who's got both of these things is going to be more valuable than someone who's got one or the other. So we can express both of these concepts mathematically by writing the social benefit, the social influence a person has on you, as, let's say, social influence of B on A, as something like the following. Sum of x divided by your total distance. So the distance is going to be the distance where you grew up, which I'll call h0a minus h0b, times your distance as adults, which I'll write as h1a minus h1b. So we basically got h0a, we can think of as education, let's say education of parents or socioeconomic status of parents. Of A's parents, right? H1A is going to be education of A as an adult. Right? And likewise for B, H0B is going to be education of B's parents. H1B, education of B as an adult. So what we're saying with a model like this, right, is that when A and B are very far apart on either dimension, getting a little bit closer to A or B doesn't matter very much, right? When these distances are really big, right, if this was a distance of 100 and 100, this social influence is super, super tiny. On the other hand, when these differences get really small, right, when A and B are very similar, this social influence becomes very large. In fact, if we take so this is exactly pulled from physics, this is a gravity model. If we take the gravity model completely seriously with no modifications, we would say that as these distances become infinitely small, the force of gravity becomes infinitely large. Now, they don't like that, right? That's not very useful. So they're going to modify this by putting a hard limit on this, by essentially adding 1 to each of these distances. We'll actually make this something like x over 1 plus the difference, right? h0a minus h0b times 1 plus the distance. Sorry. make my 1 look different from the absolute value sign, plus the distance h1a minus h1b. Right? So if a and b were identical, right, then the social influence would equal x. Right? If these differences were big, let's say the difference was 5 each, or I'll make it 4 each, right? Then the social influence would be x divided by 5 times 5, right? X over 25. This makes sense? People close to you have a much stronger influence on you than people far apart. So what does this model have to say about social mobility? Well, let's think about this by working through an example where we've got just 3 actors, right? 3 characters in our story. The main character in our story is going to be Doc, right? From the vignettes, is going to be, I'll call person A. This is going to be a low-income child, right, with a high return on human capital, right? Very high ability child, right? So he's going to start out with H0A, his parents' education level equal to 1, right? Relatively low level of parental education. He's from a working class Boston neighborhood, right? And he's choosing H1A, right? His level of education. Now, if Doc was the only person in our story, we would write down some sort of a human capital model like the one we had before, right? Something like U of H1A is going to equal 10 times H1A minus H1A squared, right? We won't even bother with some alternative. We'll just say that there's a return to human capital. He'll invest in human capital up until it's not worth it anymore, right? So he would end up with the UDH is going to be 10 minus 2H. He'll invest up until that's equal to 0. So he would choose an H equal to 5, right? Cool. But Doc isn't the only character in our story. We're going to have 2 other people who matter here. We're going to have his childhood friend, who we'll call person B. In Akerlof's story, this is one of the corner boys, right? And let's say that for person B, H0B is also equal to 1, right? They grow up together, their parents have similar levels of education. However, person B expects to also have a low level of education as an adult, right? So H1B is also equal to 1. Or at least from Doc's perspective, Doc expects his friend not to pursue education, right? To choose an H1B of 1. We're also going to have high income crosstowner, right? I have some, Harvard professor's kid, right? Who's going to have, which we'll call C. This person's going to have H0C equal to 5, right? They grew up in a high education, high income household. And Doc expects them to choose an H1C equal to 5. Does this setup make sense? So essentially, Doc is deciding how much human capital to invest in, right? He knows that his childhood friend is likely to end up with a low level of human capital. He knows that the people who will match him on human capital, if he invests in a large amount of human capital, are going to be people who grew up in very different circumstances from his. So with our gravity model, if we add these 2 social influences, right, which I'll make his friend blue and the crosstowner red, or if we add these 2 social influences, we're going to end up with a utility function like this. U of H1A is going to equal the same thing, right? 10H1A minus H1A squared that we had before, but now plus the gravity from each of these people, right? So let's say 40 over 1 plus the absolute value of H0A minus H0B, right? Times 1 plus the absolute value of H1A minus H1B. Right, so this is going to be the social influence of his friend. But then we're also going to have, and sorry, I'm going to put it on a second line, hope that doesn't mess you up too much, the social influence of the Harvard kid. Right, so that's going to be 40 over 1 plus the absolute value of H0A minus H0C times 1 plus the absolute value of H1A, minus H1C. Right? This makes sense? Cool. So if we plug in all the values we've asserted, right, this is going to become U of H1A is going to equal, well, first of all, we can be pretty confident that H1A is going to end up bigger than 1, right? There's no reason he's going to end up choosing less human capital than anyone. We expect it to be no greater than 5, right? Because he was going to choose 5 without any social influence. So I'm going to rewrite this part, the H1 part, as 1 plus, right, the difference H1A minus H1B can stay as it was, right, H1A minus H1B. And this part here is going to be 1 minus H1A minus H1C, right, because we expect that this difference here is going to be negative. Cool. So now we're going to say U of H1A is going to be 10 H1A minus H1A squared, right, his personal preferences, plus the influence from his friend. This part here is going to equal 0 because they grew up in exactly the same circumstances. So, right, 40 over 1 times 1 plus H1A minus H1B, which is 1. This is just going to be 1 times H1A. Right, this is the influence of his friend. Person B. What's the influence of the Harvard guy? It's going to be 40 over this piece, 1 plus H0A, right, which is the difference between H0A and H0C, which is 4, right? 1 plus 4, so that's going to be 40 over 5, times this difference here, right? 1 minus H1A minus H1C, right? So 5 times 1 plus H1C minus H1A, which is going to be 5 times 6 minus H1A. Okay. This is going to be the friend. Okay. So let's regroup here, and I'm going to leave it here, right? We'll play with this more moving forward, but I think we've done enough for today. So let's talk a little bit about what this is telling us. What this is telling us is, as he decides to get higher levels of education, right, beyond a level of 1, the distance from his friend is going to increase, right? If he chose an H1A of 1, the social influence from his friend would have a positive 40 effect on his utility. If he chose a level of education of 2, that would drop to 20, right? Big effects from his friend. Oh, sorry, this is person C. What am I doing? Right? From the Harvard person, the higher his level of education, the more social influence he's going to get from the Harvard person, right? Because the closer he's going to get to the Harvard person's level of education, the more they're going to have in common, the more useful this relationship is going to be. If he chose a level of 1, this would be 40 over 5 times 6 minus 1, 40 over 25, tiny level of social influence, right? If he chose an H of 5, this would become 40 over 5 times 1, would be a social influence of 8, right? Significantly more social influence. However, because he had more in common in childhood with his friend than he did with the Harvard person, the weight of his friend's social influence is much greater than the weight of the Harvard person's, right? If he matches his friend exactly, he gets a utility bonus of 40. If he matches the Harvard person exactly, right, later on in life, he's going to get a utility bonus of, as we said, right, 40 divided by 5 of only 8, right? The social influence of this Harvard person is going to be 1/5 as big for any given level of closeness in adulthood as the social influence of his friend. And so the consequence of this is going to be that because of the fact that it's hard in adulthood to adapt to a social milieu, right, a group of people who are very different from you in childhood, there's going to be a real cost to upward mobility for someone who grew up low income. There's going to be a real cost to downward mobility for someone who grew up high income, when upward or downward mobility means leaving behind the people that you grew up with. Okay, that's all I'm going to do today. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Really looking forward to working through these models with you and talking to you about their implications. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.